So what we're going to talk about today is belief in God. And it's been a while since I was asked to do this, so I'm not absolutely sure about this, but I'm pretty confident that I didn't choose this topic. I certainly didn't name it as a topic to be done, and I don't think I even said I'll do that one. So that's just by way of apologizing to whoever picked this topic in case my approach to belief in God is quite a bit different than what they had in mind. What I want to do in the short time I have with you today is talk about belief in God in our day and age from three different perspectives. And the first perspective is just a postmodern perspective of much of the culture in which we live. And I'm not going to spend hardly any time on this. And my claim is just going to be that postmodern claims about belief in God really fall apart. They're illogical. And there's a couple of categories of such claim. One is just the idea that all roads lead to God, or that all religious beliefs are equally valid. Okay? Now the reason this doesn't stand much scrutiny is many of those who make this claim, what they really mean is all religious beliefs are equally invalid. That is, they don't take seriously belief in God, and so it doesn't cost much to say those who believe in God are all in the same boat, right? But there are some people growing up in this postmodern culture who really do believe that there is some spiritual entity calling God, but that all religious roads to faith find him eventually. Okay? Now the problem with that is that it really doesn't do justice to all those religious beliefs. The Muslim really does believe that Allah is the only way, the only God, and that Muhammad is his prophet, and that everybody who believes differently is on the road to hell. So most all religious beliefs are themselves mutually exclusive relative to other religious beliefs. And in fact, even the religious pluralist, the one who says all roads lead to God, believes that that belief is correct, and everybody who disagrees with that is wrong. So you see, it's a self-refuting problem. The other postmodern claim about belief in God is arguably even more absurd, and that is the idea that my belief in God and someone else's disbelief in God are equally true. Right? That just doesn't, that's a non-starter, because we really are talking about, my belief in God is in a transcendent creator who's behind everything that we see, and her disbelief in that God doesn't have any effect on his actual existence. And if he didn't exist, my belief in him doesn't have any impact on that non-existence. Okay? That's all I'm going to say about the postmodern claims about belief in God. And with that, I'm going to turn to another prevalent belief in our culture, which is skepticism about belief in God, that comes from a point of what I'll call scientific naturalism. Okay? So we're told that belief in God is down in our culture relative to 100 years ago. And that may be true. There's a lot of polls that would say differently. A lot of Americans still believe in God and don't believe in the fundamental claims of scientific naturalism. It's certainly true that church attendance is down percentage-wise relative to 100 years ago and those sorts of things. But I want you to understand that most of the skepticism towards belief in God in our culture today comes from a foundation of scientific naturalism. Kind of the idea that somehow science has explained things so successfully without reference to God that we no longer need to even invoke the name of God as explanatory of anything. So folks like Richard Dawkins would tell us as loudly as they possibly can, as often as they possibly can, that belief in God is unreasonable and that Christian faith is just a blind lead. Okay? Now, when we get to this point where we're talking about Christianity versus, or belief in God versus scientific naturalism, really the set of beliefs in God that is at issue is Christianity. That is, the scientific naturalist is not bothering to argue against the existence of Baal or the gods of the Canaanites. He's not arguing against the existence of Bacchus or Zeus or Thor or any of the other gods of the Greeks or the Romans or the Norsemen or whatever. Really, the issue is the God, to some extent, the God of the three great monotheisms, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, but primarily the existence of the God of Christianity. And the reason that that's really the only starter in this conversation is because throughout Western history, throughout the great debate among philosophers and historians and theologians and scientists throughout Western history, it's the triune God of Christianity that has provided a satisfactory, robust explanation for everything that needs explaining. Not just the existence and proliferation of the church, but the existence of the universe in the first place, the existence of life on earth, the order in the universe and the design of the universe for life, the existence of human consciousness and of human moral law. All of those things are well explained by the God of Christianity and not by any of these other gods that we can conjure up. And so the scientific naturalist who argues against belief in God really has the God that we believe in mind, not some other. Okay? So this next statement, that scientific naturalism is fallaciously circular, cannot even justify science itself, and is at odds with all of the evidence, is a statement that takes me about 15 weeks in a college course over here at Kilns to unpack completely. Okay? So I don't have that time today. Scientific naturalism begins with the same premise that ends up in the conclusion. That is, it excludes the possibility of God's existence before it even does its research. And that's known in logical circles as viciously circular and therefore fallacious. It's bad thinking. Okay? If we adopt scientific naturalism as true, it doesn't even allow us to defend or justify science itself as a worthwhile endeavor. In other words, the logical foundation for doing science all comes from a Christian view of the world, not from a naturalistic view of the world. But the one I want to spend a little time on is the last part of this statement, which is that all of the evidence is against scientific naturalism. So the default understanding throughout at least Western history and arguably human history is that as we look around us, as we find out more about the stars and distant galaxies, and as we look at other life and the ecologies of life going on around us, as we consider human beings and the various aspects of being human, everything that we see is attributable to, is explained by a designer or a creator. That is the fundamental characteristic of everything we have always seen as we explore the world in which we live, is design and purpose and adaptation. Okay? But the fundamental aspect of scientific naturalism is a denial of such design. So Richard Dawkins himself, the new atheist, who's arguably the most obvious proponent of scientific naturalism and the most obvious opponent of belief in God, has admitted that we biologists have to remind ourselves, well, he's the one who said, we biologists study things that appear to be designed but actually are not. And Francis Crick, another scientific naturalist, says that we biologists need to remind ourselves daily that the design we perceive is only apparent. Okay? So you can picture, if you've ever seen Richard Dawkins on a YouTube video or whatever, you can picture him shaving in the morning just telling himself, the design I see is only apparent. The design I see is only apparent. Because that's the mantra of scientific naturalism. Now, within the past couple of generations, God has blessed us with overwhelming evidence of his existence and glory and power and love for mankind. That is, our newest technologies and new methodologies have opened up to scientists, modern scientists, whole new scales and whole new realms of the universe. From the macro, the most distant galaxies and black holes and things, to the nano, the insides of individual cells and the human genome and genetics itself. And at every new scale and every new level of evidence that's available to us, again, the overarching fundamental characteristic that shouts out at scientists is design and purpose. But because these don't have any place in a scientific naturalist worldview, all of that design turns out to be just apparent on that worldview. So what does the Bible say about belief in God? Well, two of the Psalms, Psalm 14 and Psalm 53, both begin with the same statement. It's the fool that says in his heart, there is no God. And so based on what I just told you about the evidence available to the modern scientist, the correlation is that the modern naturalist, the modern scientific naturalist, is really a greater fool than all fools who have come before him in denying God. So there's a passage in the first part of Romans that really gives us the Bible's perspective on this issue of belief in God. The Bible nowhere defends or provides arguments for God's existence, because God's existence is evident from the beginning to all mankind. And that's explicitly stated in Romans 1, 18 through 20, which says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse." So what this is saying is, regardless of what any person claims to believe or professes to believe about the existence of God, all men begin by knowing of God's existence. Many of us choose to suppress that knowledge for reasons having to do with a desire for autonomy or whatever else you want to talk about. But Richard Dawkins knows that there is a God. He chooses to suppress that knowledge. The famous atheist of the last century, Bertrand Russell, was once asked, well, what will you do if when you die you come before the judgment seat and face to face with God? And Bertrand Russell's reply was, I'll tell him there wasn't enough evidence. But according to Scripture, and according to what I've shared about the latest discoveries in modern science, the evidence is abundant, overwhelming, all around us, universally understood by humanity, and it's our response to it, to the knowledge we have, that leads us to claim to believe otherwise. Okay? But all of this conversation going on in culture today, from the scientific naturalists, but also somewhat contributed to by even us Christians, leads to a real misunderstanding about belief in God. And I contribute to it in a way. I spend a lot of my time doing what's known as evidential apologetics, which is really just defending the truth claims of Christianity by providing evidence as from the latest modern science. But what that tends to lead to the perception of is that somehow Christian belief is really just mental assent or intellectual agreement to a set of beliefs that the atheist doesn't have. And so Richard Dawkins says, you Christians ought to understand my atheism, because you are atheist about Bacchus and Thor and Baal and all these others. I'm just an atheist with respect to one more God than you are. But see, the perception comes to be that, well, there's about equal evidence in favor of God's existence and evidence contrary to God's existence, And Christians are just those who fall on this side of the fence, and we skeptics fall on this side of the fence. And especially since skepticism is kind of a valued, value in our culture, there's reason to fall on this side of the fence with me as a skeptic, not to be just on that side of the fence. Well, to be sure, Christianity does involve a core set of beliefs. But those beliefs are not just slightly more evidence than non-belief, as I've said, and as Romans 1 says. All of the evidence is in favor of God's existence. And in fact, Christianity the Bible has a different understanding of this word belief than simply mental assent or intellectual agreement. And so now I want to turn from scientific naturalism to, let's say, evangelical Christendom. And I want to talk about a specific belief, not just belief in God, but belief in a particular proposition that I think is misunderstood by Christians. And that's a verse that's taken from later in the same letter to the Romans by Paul. And this is Romans 10:9, which says, "Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved." And I don't know about anybody else in here, but in my growing up experience in the church, this verse was ripped out of its context and used as a formula for justifying evangelism, even with 5-year-old kids. Okay, if I can get this group of 5-year-olds to raise their hand and say Jesus is Lord, and tell me that they believe in their heart that he rose from the dead, then they're good. And I'll even tell them that they're good for the rest of their life, because they can look back on this one transaction that occurred when they were 5 years old. That is not what this verse is saying. Okay? And there's several reasons I have for believing that this verse is not primarily about mental or intellectual assent or mere profession as a one-time sort of thing. So here are those reasons. The first one I've already given you, which is that regardless of profession or belief, knowledge of God is universal within humans. Okay, we already talked about that. Romans 1:18-20, the same letter to the Romans. Not only is knowledge of God, which is a stronger thing than belief, which is a kind of changing, what do I want to align myself with right now thing, but even the demons believe and acknowledge that Jesus is the Son of God. And I've listed a couple of passages there. James 2 tells us that. And if we look at the encounters that Jesus himself had with demons, they acknowledged who Jesus was and his authority, even when the disciples that had been hanging around with Jesus were unwilling to do that. Okay? So, in this sense, belief in God is not that big a deal. Right? Okay. The third reason I think I recognize that this is not mental belief and profession is that the context of this letter tells me so. First of all, part of the context of this statement is in about a 3-chapter argument whose thesis is not just that all you got to do is simply believe and simply profess. This is part of an argument which says, since Christ came and died and rose from the dead, being an Israelite and trying to follow Moses' law is no longer going to get you anywhere. That, in fact, the main point that this verse supports is that there's only one way to be saved anymore, and that's by acknowledging Jesus as Lord and recognizing the resurrection. You Israelites are in the same boats as you Gentiles. So that's part of the context. It's not saying, here's all you got to do. Say these words, say these magic words one time, believe this for now, and you're good. That's not what this verse means. The further context is that this is the church in Rome to which Paul is writing, which, while maybe not undergoing persecution at the point in time of the writing of this letter, would within 10 or 15 years be undergoing massive persecution for just this thing that Paul is asking them to do. That is confessing Jesus as Lord and being unwilling to confess Caesar as Lord would get some of these readers of this epistle thrown to the lions or made into human torches at a garden party in Nero's palace. Okay? So Paul is asking a big deal here. Paul is saying, to ensure your continued salvation, you need to be able to be willing to confess Jesus as Lord this day and every day, and even the day when the Roman centurions come to the door. Okay? And this whole bit about believing is much more than just a mental assent, because if I'm going to be asked to throw them to the lions, I need good reason to do that. So, further reasons for why this is not just mental assent. First of all, the phrase here is believe in your heart. Now, when we think of mental assent, the physical organ that we relate to mental processes is the brain, right? So did Paul just get it wrong when he said the heart? No, what Paul is saying very deliberately here through the Holy Spirit is that this belief that I'm talking about is at the very core of your being. That belief in the resurrection should be fundamental to who you are now that you've come to follow Christ. It's not a one-time belief. It's not a one-time profession. This belief should be at the core of your heart. Moreover, the Greek word used here for believe is pisteus, which almost or maybe never is used of mere mental assent, but has the meaning in the Greek that Paul is using of complete trust or total reliance upon the referent of that belief. So what I take him to be saying to these Roman believers is that when the time comes where your profession of Jesus as Lord may get you sentenced to execution, the reason that you can be confident in making that profession nonetheless is because you live in a world where God has raised Jesus from the dead. And that has made all the difference. That post-resurrection, everything is changed, and that should give you confidence to meet death at the hands of the lion. I don't have time to even list, let alone discuss, all of the logical ramifications that flow out from the fact that in the space-time of this world, God raised Jesus from the dead. It is life-changing in any number of respects. I have a quote here by Jaroslav Pelikan, who died about 6 years ago, but was a history professor at Yale University. And he says, if Christ is risen, nothing else matters. And if Christ is not, nothing else matters. This is his way of saying that this is the most important event in history. This circles back to that scientific naturalism and says if scientific naturalism is true, then nothing really matters. There's no purpose to existence. There's no purpose to the existence even of the universe. Okay? So all I want to say, just to say one of the many ramifications that flow out of the resurrection, is that according to Scripture, the death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth is not just the most important event in the history of the Roman believers in the first century. It's not just the most important event in human history. It's the most important event in all of cosmic history. And in fact, it's the reason God created the universe in the first place, that event might take place. And so, as I leave you here today, I want to leave you with the thought that along with those first century Roman believers, we need to recognize that we can live every day confessing Jesus as Lord and knowing that the fact of his resurrection, that God raised him from the dead in space and time, has completely changed the playing field and gives us every reason to go on living. And that's what I have for you.